Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined yet again today by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. Good late morning, Josh.
Thank you. Good morning to you.
Well, thank you.
Well, you know.
So I thought what we'd do today is circle back to the dominant story that we talked about a lot last week, but has seen some significant developments in the interim.
As expected.
And that would be, of course, the political repercussions of the search warrant that was executed last week, now about 10 days ago at Mar-a-Lago and the Trump work areas and living areas, that resulted in the removal of several boxes of documents. Now, when we recorded last week on Wednesday, it's remarkable how different the story looked.
Right.
I mean, given that this had a lot to do with what we didn't know at the time and some of the things that I think we almost assumed were the case in terms of what the motivation was here, what the warrant, what the reason for the search was.
Right.
That turned out to be very different, right? So, you know, last week we talked a lot about how reflexively many Republicans, including the most prominent Texas Republicans, including Governor Abbott and Senator Cruz, really went from 0 to 60 in denouncing the search on Monday night as Nixonian, Gestapo-like, a sign that they'll be coming for you next. Right. The implication being, without any evidence, and in fact, lots of evidence to the contrary, that the Biden administration had ordered this search in order to undermine their possible, undermine Donald Trump as a possible contender in 2024.
And also lots of basic logic to the contrary. But anyway.
Yeah, exactly. There were a lot of things that were, not right about it. And we talked a lot about that last week, even based on what we knew. Lots of developments since then. Two very important ones, I think, if we're going to talk about the political response, although some of the other stuff that's come out will certainly come up as we talk about this. Mm-hmm. One was the armed attack on an FBI office in Cincinnati last Thursday, wound up with the attacker killed in a shootout in a rural area not too far from that office. The shooter was a regular on Trump's Truth social network, posted things that made it seem as if he was at least in part motivated or triggered, if you will, by the raid on the compound.
Yeah, and I believe I read this morning, too, he's still under investigation for activities around January 6th. I mean,
right, he was not a stranger to the
active
FBI.
In the space.
Right. And then the other, which followed the next day on Friday was the release of the search warrant and the property receipt for items that were removed by the FBI. And while there wasn't a ton of detail, there wasn't enough detail in the characterization of the boxes and packages of, batches of documents that were removed that we know that there were some different levels of top secret and classified documents, but also some that were highly classified, right. That are usually, to be viewed only in a very secure facility, et cetera.
Right. Which is not the basement of Mar-a-Lago?
Right. It is not the basement of Mar-a-Lago. And the statement of probable cause for the search, which was not really what everybody had been speculating about. The initial speculation had been that this was about the violation of a law passed in 1978 that requires presidents to turn over all their documents and affirms the fact that these belong to the country, to the National Archives, not to the office holder. But it turned out that this was really much more about national security issues, these classified documents, and the fact that there had been ongoing negotiations, even previous visits. They knew these documents were there. A Trump lawyer had signed an affidavit to the effect that there were no more classified documents there, and the FBI did not believe them. And so now there's an old issue of obstruction.
Right, yeah.
a cover-up, et cetera, right? And that they were holding on to some of these documents that are not supposed to be out in the wild. And, something I hadn't put in the notes, but also I think is worth flagging is that at an earlier meeting, I think in early June, with FBI officials and counterintelligence officials, the FBI had reviewed videotapes of one of the areas where these documents were being stored, and they saw something that they didn't like.
Right.
That suggested to them that the area was not secure. They had them put a padlock on it,
right,
et cetera. So, all of which leads us to how Republicans are now positioning themselves vis-a-vis these developments, the search itself, the actions of the FBI, the imputations that this was, as we've said, without any evidence, a politically motivated action aimed at Trump rather than what is actually in the document, in the court documents,
right,
et cetera. And, we've seen interesting dynamics in the last week where, we talked a lot last week about how quickly people jumped on this. You were saying even last week, I think, and people were saying, there had been even some reporting that there were people from inside the Trump camp urging people to maybe cool their jets,
right, that
another shoe was going to drop. Other shoes definitely dropped. And so we've seen some adjustments now, right?
Right. And I think, as I said, we spend a lot of time because of, our focus is on the politics of this stuff always. And we spent a lot of time last week talking about sort of the presence or, really exploring the presence or absence of a political calculus and the immediate response and how sort of uniform it was and how strong it was. With more information coming out, you're kind of seeing, I was saying there's an evolution to these things. And I mean that, in a classical evolution, some of these arguments remain and they kind of, refine and they work themselves out to kind of where we land. And some of them kind of drop by the wayside a little bit. And I think, what you've seen is, the predominant, I think, Republican sort of response to this one, I think really marked by both Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and then our Governor Greg Abbott, is basically, sort of it gives a better read, I think, of the final calculation on this. And I think it tells us something that kind of actually is informative about sort of other things that are going on, right? And what you see about, I think, where DeSantis and Abbott landed was to basically say, look, it's basically to play on the dark demons that already exist, which are, negative attitudes towards the federal government, which are widespread in the Republican Party.
Yeah, we talked about some of the polling on that last week.
Right. Negative attitudes towards Joe Biden, which are, extremely widespread in the Republican Party. Ideas about a deep state and potential, again, this idea that especially Democrats are going to mobilize, basically government in whatever manifestation to basically crack down on, dissidents now, the sort of thing that's sort of floating around out there. And so you endorse all these things by saying, the FBI has, gone overboard. This is tyranny. This is a banana republic, et cetera, et cetera. But what you're not hearing a lot of is and what Donald Trump did was fine.
Right.
But the thing is you're not hearing any condemnation of that either. And that's really the perfect sweet spot, right? Because basically you're saying the same things in a lot of ways that Donald Trump is saying about the administration.
The sweet spot in political terms.
Yeah, in political terms. Yeah, I mean, in normative terms, it's a horrible spot. We'll get to that.
Right. If you're a Republican trying to position yourself.
Yeah, you get to say, hey, look, you don't have to say I defended what the president did because right now you're not really clear exactly where this is going to go. But you can say the same, enemies that he's pointing out, those are my enemies too. And therefore I'm in league. But there's plausible deniability. I'm not justifying what the president has done.
I'm fighting the good fight, and I'm fighting it for principles and to protect the republic. And we'll put a pin on that.
Yeah, we'll put a pin on that.
Rather than than the former president per se.
Right, and so this is so on just from a political standpoint, say this is the sweet spot, right? I mean, you basically get to say, look, I'm playing on themes that are very prominent in Republican politics and among Republican voters. I'm echoing the president, which allows me to say that I'm supporting him without necessarily endorsing any actions that you may have to eventually, justify why you would have, again, justify the president's actions. But the results obviously can be pretty messy and dangerous here, like when people take guns to FBI field offices. And also, I think, you see a similar parallel here in the other kind of, I would say, maybe one of the big stories in Texas this week about the effect this is having on the administration of elections, where, again, you're seeing something similar, whereby on the one hand, we are talking a lot about primary elections in which candidates either, win, and a lot of times fueled by, denial of the 2020 election and endorsement of Donald Trump's vision of what happened there, right? And then obviously, very high profile cases like Representative Liz Cheney losing
Right.
Because she basically didn't endorse this view of it. Now, there's actually something pretty parallel here.
We'll come back to Cheney because Cheney is actually even a step beyond a lot of that. I mean,
right.
The contrast between Cheney and the people you're talking about is an interesting one, but keep going.
Right, but I guess the main point here is, this overall political dynamic, you can kind of see it playing itself out, which is to say, well, we can't, there's a little bit more reticence to justify Trump's actions around the election, around January 6th, but you can still see a lot of Republicans continuously parroting the claims of fraudulent elections, of fraudulent election administration, of voter fraud. And again, it provides the same amount of plausible deniability to say, well, if something comes out that says, well, we have these, email, we have these text messages between Trump telling someone, we'll send the people with the guns or whatever, whatever it is. He said, whoa, I didn't say that was okay. But it doesn't mean that the underlying electoral process isn't damaged. Now, again, just like in the case of this, where the FBI and Mar-a-Lago search leads a man to basically go and attack an FBI office, the other kind of big story in this week was, these instances of harassment of local election officials here in Texas, right?
And we should mention that was an interesting, what really kicked that off this news cycle, in the last couple of weeks was reporting that actually started in the local Fredericksburg paper, I think, that the local, county level election officials, like there were 3 of them, had all kind of resigned en masse because they were being harassed and receiving threatening phone calls and, just kind of didn't want to deal with it anymore.
Right.
Ultimately.
And I think it's important to point out, if you're listening and you're not, familiar with the geography of Texas, Fredericksburg is probably, I would think, about 80 miles west of Austin, give or take.
Yeah, something like that. Maybe not even that far. I don't.
Yeah, 60 to 80 miles west of Austin. It's in Gillespie County. This is a county that in 2020, 79% of the vote went to Donald Trump. This is not a Democratic county. Presumably, if 79% of the vote went to Trump, you'd think that good chance that Trump voters are running the election process in Gillespie County.
Yeah, those hill country counties, Gillespie County being one of them, are long-time Republican bastions. I mean, they were one of the areas where, there were, Republicans sort of sat out the 100-year storm between, between Reconstruction and the Civil Rights era. Those are some of the few counties that were where there were, there were real Republicans for a long time. So this is not like an embattled area. Right.
And this is part of, the thing is, there's a way you can kind of zoom out and you can zoom in and zoom out again on this, right? But ultimately, this came up. I was asked to kind of give like a hot take on for the KXAN, report on this, and I wasn't still kind of figuring out what to say. But one of the things I said to them was like, you should probably like reach out to some of the big counties in Texas, like Bexar County, where San Antonio is, or Harris County, where Houston is, or Dallas County, because my guess would be those election officials there are receiving a lot of harassment and
as it turned out, there was a story that came out of San Antonio and Bexar like the next day.
Yeah, basically at a meeting of the sort of election administrators, basically saying, this is what it's been like. And in addition to the fact, Texas has made it kind of harder for us, not because of, mostly because of the new laws that essentially are adding, increasing reporting requirements, greater scrutiny, more penalties, more power to poll watchers. But on top of that, you've got tons and tons of people filing Freedom of Information Act requests, basically deluging these departments to try to find this fraud.
Yeah, I think in Bexar, I could be wrong, but I believe it was in Bexar County where they were, filing open records requests for every ballot.
For every ballot, for the source code, for the machines.
They had to hire people to process these requests. It's clearly like a form of harassment.
Yeah, well, and I would say, look, on its face, on its face, there's nothing wrong with that. Those laws exist for a reason. I think if anything, Texas actually, has, a spotty history with the way that it, is transparent with open records requests. So I don't think that in and of itself, but it does raise this broader issue, which is, you kind of take a step out. You can keep stepping back, and you'd say, we're looking at all these elections for, often cases, secretaries of states in places like Georgia, Michigan, Arizona especially, where you have candidates using the small d democratic process, and fueled by campaigns fueled by the same conspiracy theories that Donald Trump is promoting, and really an overt and naked plea to take partisan control of the election process.
Right.
So you've got that set of attitudes, right, and that sort of thing going on, and we're seeing that all over the place. But then the same set of underlying attitudes that we were talking about here, both, the conspiracy theories, but then also, sort of negative attitudes towards, the election system and towards election
lack of
officials.
trust in the validity of the system.
Right. That's leading to, again, I would say this happening at more local levels with people trying to take over, county level election positions and things like that. In Michigan, there's a story where the Secretary of State in Michigan is concerned that there are a number of county canvassers, they're called there, who basically have not committed that they will certify the upcoming elections, which, if you just kind of take a step back and say, well, yeah, why should someone commit to certifying the election? Say, I don't know. I think maybe some people might say the person whose job it is to run the election smoothly might be able to say, yeah, we expect to certify the election results. But part of this is that the same set of, attitudes and theories leading people to sort of potentially go into mostly Republican counties and say, yeah, we might just grind this to a halt.
Yeah.
And then this is the other thing, though. And then you've got this sort of other set of actors, which is much more disparate, right? Who are taking, again, the same set of conspiracy theories, the same set of attitudes, and calling election officials and leaving voicemails threatening to end their bloodline. And this comes from, a report that, I guess, what is this? This is from the
Democratic staff of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform put out a report last week called Exhausting and Dangerous, the Dire Problem of Election Misinformation and Disinformation. And that's, got a little, it got some attention because it was written by majority staff. It was seen as a partisan document.
Right.
But it did have a lot of interesting things. And in particular, they focused on Arizona, Florida, Ohio, and Texas, where, it was found that this election misinformation appeared to be having significant impact. So, and there was evidence of coordinated campaigns, in the directions that you're talking about.
And so, at least, so this is all the setup, but again, it gets to the point where, I'm sort of...
It's a long setup.
It's a long... Well, hey, Dewey, welcome. This is a running commentary between us. But, it does raise a sort of issue. I say, you kind of go back and say, as someone who watches the process and studies government, the American system certainly tolerates, and the American public certainly tolerates a fair amount of, I'd say, people in political power having avenues to use the political process to try to maintain their power. We see that in the incumbency advantage. We see that in gerrymandering. We can see that in the fact that, basically the majority party can pass any election laws more or less that it wants that don't, violate the law. And so we allow this, right? And I don't, that's an observation, right? That's not a criticism or anything. And that's one thing, right? And then you've got this sort of small d democratic effort of people running for office to, sort of put their finger on the scale of the electoral process. And that's not the same thing, but I'd say it's in the open, right? Because they're campaigning and they're telling you exactly.
Well, yeah. There's two different, let me add a couple of overlay points
please.
On that. So, one in terms of, the tolerance or the expectation of some degree of partisan inflection of, to use a term that used to be fairly neutral, but is now being used by these people to be kind of, basically leverage over the administrative apparatus of the state.
There you go.
Right. But, as you were talking about that, while we expect a certain degree of that.
Yeah.
In a way, it's been kind of a settled model in the United States that goes back to, administrative reform movements that limited patronage that began in the late 19th century and really went into effect in the early 20th century. Hatch Act, basically the creation of civil servants, right, that are supposed to be insulated, at the operational level from the kinds of things we're talking about. And so, you have appointees, and appointees impact the direct, particularly at the federal level, impact the direction of the bureaucracy. We see that at the state level. And then on top of that, and then parallel to that, you also have the historical development of something that has also settled around that time, that also became, it seemed like, at least in the intermediate term, kind of a settled issue, which is that the election administration apparatus should be particularly insulated from political influence because it is so close. It's the vehicle for political competition and for registering popular preferences. And I think that, what we're witnessing now in various places is a challenge of both of those, settled models of how we're going to administer government and administer elections, right? And one of the interesting things is you were talking about Gillespie County and San Antonio, the Democratic report. If you go back to earlier this year and into last year, the person in charge of elections, the county clerk in Travis County, Dana DuBois, recently stepped down after a long and, frankly, pretty illustrious tenure as she was like a national figure involved in elections administration.
If you're pro-participation.
She was basically, under investigation, not because a bunch of, the kind of folks that we're talking about are activists were questioning what she was doing. She was under investigation by the Attorney General, the Republican Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who was, and we should say, Dana DuBois is partisan. I mean, she's a Democrat in Travis County.
Right.
She's won 1 million elections in Travis County. You don't do that as a Republican. And those charges were ultimately dropped.
Well, they couldn't get, I don't know if they could get an indictment.
Right. They couldn't get the indictment and, cost her some money. She wound up getting that compensated. But the point being, I guess the other overlay point I want to make here is that there's an interesting elite mass dynamic here that goes both to the efforts to impact the machinery of elections that predates Trump, as we were talking. I mean, this is a long-term...
Yeah, Trump didn't make this up.
Right. There's been a long-term, effort in Texas, as in other places, to raise doubts about the integrity of the electoral process.
Right.
With, that goes back, at least a decade, if not a decade and a half or so. We could unpack that if we wanted. But there is a, elite mass dynamic going on here that goes back quite a while that I do think elites have some blame for, but now it's impacted public attitudes, right? And it's impacted public attitudes in a partisan template. And we've talked about it on the podcast. It's been a while, but we've asked, pairs of questions about different partisan frames about people's doubts about elections, know. And to oversimplify, Republicans are very likely as a group to think that people are voting that are not eligible to vote legally.
Right.
That's usually very adjacent to wildly unsubstantiated claims that undocumented non-citizens are voting. Right. Democrats are very likely to think that people that are eligible to vote are being prevented from voting.
Right.
And that's not new.
Yeah.
And that comes from, to some degree, particularly in the Republican case, and, if somebody was here would say, well, wait just a second, and that'd be fair. But both Democrats and Republicans are modeling this. But the Republican kind of position now that electoral institutions have so little integrity that what we're seeing is basically the jettisoning, to my mind, of the principle of an impartial election apparatus,
if not the principle of democracy.
Right, and that, but I think that falls out of that, right? Or I think probably in different cases. We were talking beforehand. For those of you that haven't seen it, Robert Draper, who, probably well known to some of you, wrote in Texas for a long time, is now doing stuff mainly for the New York Times Magazine, has a very good long piece on the kind of what you're pointing to, the ideological underpinnings of the movement to take over election apparatus that is built on the assumption that the election apparatus is inherently corrupt. And it's inherently corrupt in part because it's been subject to too much small d democratic influence to some degree.
Right? Yeah.
And it sort of enters these long-standing arguments on the right about, the catchphrases, and Draper does a good job of re-raising this, going back to Barry Goldwater and even before that, ultimately, that, the United States should not be thought of as a democracy. It should be thought of as a republic.
Right.
And the implications of that are that, do go back to debates at the time of the founding and in political philosophy, if you want to go that far, about, the fact that you need to modulate democracy,
Right.
in a literal sense, that direct democracy is a threat. You were sort of implying this before. Too much participation is there's such a, put it this way, there's such a thing as too much participation and too much voting, and that is a shift. The fact that argument has become so much more prominent in these debates is a shift from the era of where it was seen as an unambiguous normative good by the majority of people to expand participation.
Yeah, I think the takeaway line in that Draper article, if you're takeaway one, is this idea, some candidate in Arizona basically says, America is not a democracy, it's a republic. And the idea that, and it's saying, just take a pause for a second and say the idea that, a candidate for major office in the United States would come out and say, this is not a democracy, not in terms of as a criticism,
right,
but as a statement of fact, is pretty interesting. The thing to me that I think, again, as someone who kind of likes to think about these things from the strategic perspective of politics, is how out of control this is. I mean, because again, I said the same sets of attitudes are resulting in, sort of anti-democratic efforts at multiple different levels. And in the case of, I think the harassment of election administrators, I think, borders the line of, if not crosses the line of what you'd call terrorism, right? Because ultimately you're trying to influence the actions of basically, civil servants who are trying to run the process for political ends. Yeah. That's terrorism, right?
You've raised that a couple of times as we've been talking about this in different contexts when we were working on the poll yesterday.
Yeah.
It's funny. I mean, I see that, and maybe this is just, I don't know, who knows what this is, but the term that really occurs to me though is more like organized crime or racketeering.
But see, but
right?
but here's
which hinges on intimidation, violence,
but here's
threat of violence.
But see, but here's the thing, though. I mean, I would agree if I go back to where I was starting that point, which is, but I'm not sure. When we were talking about what for example, I was talking to you in reaction to the Gillespie thing before I was talking to the KXAN. And we were just talking about, you'd said something I think was important, which is like, well, what's the goal of these people? Now, when you say these people, part of it is it's already a disparate group of people who are, leaving nasty voicemails and threats on phones. So I think automatically, it's easy to kind of say, well, let's discount that. But it's an important question, right?
Yeah.
And I think, part of it is I go back, it's one thing to say I'm running to be, the election, the chief election administrator in Georgia, right? And here's what I want to do. It's another thing to say, I'm running to be the county, commission, the county canvasser in this district in Michigan, because even though the vote went 80-20 for Trump, the whole process is screwed up. And, I'm going to go in there, I'm going to find it. And if anything, I don't even know if I can trust these votes enough to canvass it. And it's another thing still to say, I'm going to end your bloodline because you've been involved in running elections here, wherever here is. And I can't say, and this is the thing I think is a little bit scary about this. I think if you went and said to Greg Abbott, Ted Cruz, honestly, what do you think the end goal is here? Where do you think we're going to get with this? Even if they can give you a clear answer, I don't think they can give you a clear answer for the people who are calling and making these threats.
Yeah.
And I don't think that they can necessarily give you an answer for the people kind of who are running for these generally pretty low level, really administrative offices that are almost they're public service to make sure the election run well, and trying to basically see what you can do at a local level, which again, in an era in which there's no trust in journalism, very little local journalism, what's going to happen kind of under the radar as you sort of put people in office who are basically already saying, my number one job isn't to run a good election. My number one job is to,
make sure one side wins. And if I have, and prevent the other side from winning And
I mean, it's a very, and again, just like saying, the FBI is run by fascists and you need to watch out, might lead someone to take a gun to an FBI office. This constant rhetoric about elections, even in a place like Texas where Republicans have won for 20 plus years, and even counties where they've overwhelmingly won, I can't say where that goes, but it doesn't look good.
Look, I don't know if I'm sure you remember this if you remembered it in this context.
Yeah.
I mean, we did an op-ed about a year ago, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Saying, all this stuff, we should, urging Texas leaders.
Yeah.
Not to ride the train on delegitimizing the election process because it would lead to bad places. We are in a bad place, and that's not I told you so. I mean, all kinds of, that was in the air.
Yeah,
I mean, we've been talking about that. But I mean, that's where we are. I mean, a little point on the, I mean, and your guy Matty Iglesias this morning, I don't know if you got to it. I didn't read the whole thing, which I often don't with Matt, but he starts with a thing about how you can get too wound up about language, but but linguistic differences do. I can't remember what he was talking about, but in this case, this is I want to think more because it just occurred to me in real time. This kind of terrorism, criminality. I mean, it's a fairly recent development that we think about terrorism so much.
Yeah,
in the historical sense, where, and I've been watching a not very good TV show about the making of The Godfather for those of you that are watching it, The Offer. But there's a lot of stuff about, the mob in there. And, there's something about all this that in terms of thinking about the political language of it, I'm intrigued by terrorism, racketeering, criminal, just in terms of how you communicate to people about this.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, terrorism obviously pushes a big button, but it's also, to me, it's a little big in a certain way. Now, this is big,
but that's the thing. I think, I would say,
No, I get the point, but I'm also also from a tactical point of view, what's the crime here? In terms of when people are calling and threatening people, and
that's why from a language, I think that's why from a language perspective, and again, the terrorism thing. I mean, the crime piece on this, I think you actually create a higher bar for yourself from a political standpoint if you say, well, this is conspiracy, this is racketeering, this is whatever you want to say, using those mob language, because ultimately that requires some kind of an organized conspiracy. The only thing that is organizing this is the fact that Trump is such a force in the Republican Party. He continues to make these false claims about the election. These false claims continue to have, a significant impact on the direction of Republican politics and the actions of Republican elected officials. And even if those Republican elected officials are figuring out that, there's a way to kind of have it both ways and sort of, push through on the same, push the same buttons that Trump is pushing, while not necessarily endorsing Trump. The only thing is that, and I don't know how to say this any other way, but Trump is so clearly, his self-interest in this is so apparent.
Yeah.
And what's not, anywhere in any place of this, speaking about leadership, is any person really pushing, the interest of the country in any sort of,
and again,
notable way. And
something we've talked about, institution, at some point you have to own that you're eroding institutions.
Right. And the institutional backstop, the idea that, the institutions will be able to withstand this. Well, right. This is a direct attack on the institutions.
And while I don't want to saint her in any way, this does lead to the fact that Liz Cheney lost resoundingly in the Republican primary last night in Wyoming, as expected.
Right.
But she's framing her resistance in those terms.
Yeah. Well, and
pretty directly, right?
But yeah. And I mean,
as we're talking about, elite modeling, if you will,
right,
and signal sending, I mean, she's very much in the minority in her party right now.
Right.
And if the polling is to be believed, certainly as we're seeing consistently in our polling, she's swimming against the tide of public opinion among Republicans right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I mean, and so what I would say is, the things I would like, I'm trying to sort of where do we land on this? What are we taking away from this? And I mean, for me, the things that I'm really thinking about is, and for the sort of people who listen to this podcast, which I think, in a lot of cases, a lot of reporters and people are pretty, tied into this kind of stuff is one, to think about how much lumping and splitting we're doing between a lot of actions that are being driven by the same sets of attitudes, right? Yeah. And by the same people. I think, we need to be, and I don't know where I land on this, but I think we need to be, either justified in thinking of these as all as one thing, or clear about where they are and where they aren't different. But even if we are going to do a little too much splitting here, I mean, I think it is important to note that whether you're running for Secretary of State of Arizona or whether you're making a call to an election administrator, if the goals are the same here, I mean, we kind of have to start to ask how we're treating this stuff. And then I think to your point, how should we be talking about this? I mean, I'm pretty comfortable saying, if you're calling up election administrators and threatening them physically with violence if they basically engage in the conduct of elections, you're a terrorist. I mean, right. tell me. I'm welcome. I'll welcome.
Well,
people
what I would say
me.
to that, and we got to close out. But if you go back and you look at the language of what that committee report came,
Right.
One of the points that they really wanted to make was that yes, there's this kind of decentralized, atavistic, some guy, and there are a lot of guys, although women are prominent in this as well. But, sitting around like making, nasty phone calls to election administrators. But they were key about saying the investigation uncovered coordinated campaigns that did link these things together. And that does give you some, and that was clearly what they're after, some surface area to begin to link these things together and think about them as organized efforts and, engage them in that way. And I mean, what's tricky about that is that, whether somebody is saying, okay, person X, your job is to file 1 million open records requests. Person Y, you're on the phones tonight calling, making nasty phone calls. Person Z, whether that is exactly what's going on or not, there is some general awareness, and this kind of comes out in the Draper piece in Arizona, that all of these things are going on and that they are mutually supportive efforts. I
agree with
there are people that realize that.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think, and that's
in that messaging, and that's a Trump model.
Yeah, and in messaging, I would say, the Democrats do themselves some service by trying to, say this is coordinated if there's coordination, because then it sort of takes away the dismissal of, oh, well, this is just some guy in his basement making calls.
Yeah, exactly. You're trying to be conspiratorial about just a few cranks.
At the same time, I think, you're not going to, they're not going to find, smoking gun evidence of some kind of nationwide coordinated effort because, it's not necessary. The point is that this is happening because elites continue to push rhetoric that creates the environment for coordination, whether or not there's explicit coordination or not.
You were reaching for a takeaway a minute ago, and I think to me, that's one of the things that kind of comes out of this.
Right.
That, if you look at this in the longer sweep that goes back well before Donald Trump, what we've seen is a series of signaling by elites that those signals have been picked up, replicated, and have metastasized and are now feeding back on elite behavior. Right. And that's part of why you have a DeSantis, an Abbott, several figures that are now going, okay, I need to position myself in this. I can't just wash my hands of it because these are my people.
Yeah.
So I think on that, I'm going to thank Josh for being here. As always, thank our excellent staff in the audio studio here in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at UT Austin. They're getting busy again. There are students on campus. I think they're just rushing, I think. But you can feel campus stirring, I think, and they are busier in here. So as always, we thank them for their steady support and tolerance of our bad habits. And remember, you can find all the data that Josh and I were talking about today, much, much more, at the Texas Politics Project website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.